Hello and welcome to part 11 of my panoramic photography tutorial series. My name is Florian and as always, shameless plug, I run the website Panoramas. Please make sure you check it out and let me know what you think. As I said, this is part of a tutorial series. Here's the YouTube playlist. I'll put a link somewhere in the description so you can find it. But anyway, this is installment number 11. Make sure if you haven't seen the other parts that you check them out. I definitely start from the very beginning, shooting the images, and then work my way through a bunch of related topics. Now, today's topic is going to be about HDR panoramas, or how HDR photography applies to 360 by 180 fully spherical panoramas. And it's a huge topic in itself, or HDR photography is a topic in itself. I don't want to explain everything from start to finish. I totally recommend this book, the HDRi Handbook, version 2.0. It's a wonderful read. I can absolutely recommend it. Still working my way through it. It also has a chapter on how this applies to panoramic photos, but I think I have a slightly better technique to present you as the author is presenting. Nonetheless, this is a very, very good book and fully valid. Make sure you check it out. You can even get it as digital version, so you can put it on your phone and read it whenever you find some time. It's a fairly thick book. Now, when you shoot panoramas, you always got the option of shooting handheld or tripod. And as you know, I'm a big fan of shooting handheld, but when it comes to HDR panoramas, you really, really want to use a tripod. I mean, it is, as always, it is possible to do it handheld, but you'll just be doing so much editing to get a flawless image. You really, really want to use a tripod. So then once you've taken your images, or just quickly, how do you take your images? Well, pretty much as always, you take a consistent set of images with everything in manual settings, so you don't change your white balance, you don't change your aperture or ISO and so on. The only thing, of course, that you're going to do is you're going to take brackets of the different images. And there it's very important that you do take consistent or the same brackets for all the shots. So rather than just doing one set of exposures, you're doing multiple set of exposures. And for that, use your bracketing function in your camera and just fire consistent sets of brackets for each of the shots you want to take. And the reason for that is that pretty much all panoramic stitching software, they all expect all the brackets to be there for each shot that you're taking. Now, let me show this quickly. Here's a panorama that I took earlier at a sunset, which I just missed. But this is not the most artistic panorama, and in general, I'm not the most talented HDR processor out there. Definitely not. But I still want to show you one of the many ways you can do this. Of course, you can tone map your images before or after stitching. When you do tone map them before, then you really have no problems, because all you end up is just with a single set of images that you're just going to stitch together in the completely normal way, and you're done. But if you want to tone map your image or exposure fusion your image after stitching, then you're going to have some problems. Now, either you can use your Panorama software's tone mapper, like PTGui Pro has got a tone mapper built in, or even Exposure Fusion. Giga does that as well. They won't have these kinds of issues that are going to occupy us for the rest of this video, but only when you're using just independent tone mapping software. So here's an example of this. This is the final panorama that I merged to a 32-bit floating point image and then basically tone mapped using Lightroom. And this is the image that I got. It looks pretty good, you might say. Yep, that is the case. Now let's just open up that image in our favorite panorama viewer, and you will see that not everything is fine with this image. So, yep, a little warning. Yep, all looking good, right? Well, no. You can see this big, huge line straight through the middle, goes all the way from the top. Well, you can't see it very well on the bottom, but from the bottom all the way to the top, and you get this ugly vortex at the zenith. So the problem, or the reason for that, is that Lightroom isn't aware of what the edges in this frame mean. So as you know, in a spherical panorama, the edges have a very specific meaning. Namely, this edge here, the side edges, they're meant to join up together. So this needs to join up with this. But Lightroom doesn't know that, so it's processing each part of the image locally with different settings. That's the whole idea of tone mapping, and it just applies one set of settings, brightnesses or whatever to this edge, and another set to that edge. You can even see it if you look closely. This is a bit more yellowy and there's a bit more orangey here. But anyway, that's how you get that big horizontal line Now, another problem is with the top and the bottom of the frame. The top of the frame basically all joins up. So imagine this is a flat thing, and you're trying to curl it back into a ball, into a sphere, and all this edge at the top is going to join up. And again, same problem. Lightroom doesn't know that all these pixels basically belong together and should be treated in a similar way. And the same problem happens at the bottom. It's not very visible in this shot, but in another photo you would see that as well. So there is, I think Photomatics is aware of the sideways boundary here. So I think there's an option you can tick for, tell it that it's a panorama, and then it'll try to join these two edges up. But I think, as far as I know, it doesn't do that for the top edge. So you're still going to have your ugly vortex problem, I believe. Haven't tried it, but I'm quite sure that is the case. So what can we do about this? So let's jump right into PTGui and have a look at that. So let's open it up, close that one, don't need it. I'm going to import the images. That's all my brackets here. Going to set my crop, as always, take one of the brighter images. Now before I go any further, I'm going to jump over here to the Exposure HDR tab. Now, if you don't see that tab, that might be because you're in simple mode. In that case, you only have these tabs here, so you might have to switch to advanced mode. So in the Exposure HDR tab, and by the way, this is only part of the PTGui Pro version. So if you just bought PTGui, then you're unfortunately out of luck. I'm going to enable HDR stitching. And now PTGui is telling me that it contains 6 sets of 3 bracketed exposures, so that's good. So as you can see, PTGui wants to see bracketed exposures in a very consistent way. And then it says the bracketed exposures are not linked. So that means each and every image is treated separately. And PTGui will attempt to align the individual bracketed exposures. So all images could be anywhere, and it's not sort of taken into account that every set of 3 images basically is the same direction. It's just different brightness, but it's the same viewing direction. So then it says if the images were taken from a tripod, which is the case here, you may want to link the brackets. And I've done that, clicked on that. Now these images are linked. So what that means is PTGui, if I, for instance, go into the masking tab, treats these images together. So if I draw a big line through here, you'll see this gets automatically added to the other 2 images, which are part of that first bracket. Now, in order to speed things up, I'm going to apply a few masks here to the images. Again, stitching 101 is a different topic. And I'll open the nadir image. I've got a different prepared mask. And the nice thing with this panorama is at this point, I'm just going to tell the optimizer to optimize. And you can see if I click here, it also treats everything as grouped images. Enable the viewpoint correction, and then I'm going to start aligning the image. It brings up again the same sort of question. Appears to have bracketed exposures. What do you want to do? Either you can enable the HDR mode and link the bracketed images. This is what we want to do because we took the images from a tripod. You can do that without linking the images. This is what you want to do if you're shooting handheld. Again, I don't recommend this option. You can try it if you want, but it'll take you a lot of time to get a nice result. Or third of all, you can say, well, it's not a HDR exposure set. Do not enable HDR mode. Nope, it is in one, so we want that. And we also want to select True HDR. And then PTGui is going to align the images. Now what it's doing though is it's not going to match each and every image with each other. It's, I think, only just going to match the different exposure levels, exposure layers together. So there we go. It's done a pretty good job, as we can see. It's all there. Let's just initialize and optimize. Oh, very good. That is great. I like that. Now, I just want to quickly level that panorama. There's not a lot of straight features in this panorama here, so I'm just going to do it manually. There's probably not going to be very precise, but it'll do for the job. Okay, well, I think we need to add a little bit of roll. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a pedantic person, I think. Yes. Come on, it's 0.5. About there-ish. Now, we're happy with the panorama. We can have a quick look at it in the preview. As you can see, PTGui is not doing anything. It's not sort of blending the images at all, but it's still put them together, and we can see it's all there. Not going into great detail. We'll just leave it at that. Yep, we're in HDR mode, so let's see and export this image. So what I want to do in this case, I want to use an external tone mapper. I could use PTGui, so if you go to the HDR tab, you can click on tone map settings, it'll generate a preview image, and you can do your tone mapping in here. I don't want to do that. You could also alternatively use exposure fusion, which typically looks a lot more natural. So you could use all the built-in tools, but again, I want to show you how you can do this, how you can use an external stitcher. So I'll leave it at true HDR. This is important because then we get a bunch of output options. As you can see, there's a whole bunch more things out here. Maximum size. I would like to export, so I don't care about the low LDR, the low dynamic range. I'd only care about the high dynamic range. And what I want is the HDR Panorama. And I don't want the tone map Panorama. For this one here, I'm going to select TIFF. If I could click TIFF 32-bit compression, no alpha channel. That way I can actually directly load it in Lightroom, which is the tool that I like to use the most for my tone mapping. So let me just double check everything's all right. Yep, we'll use a fast interpolator. You could use a better interpolator or a different stitcher here, but I'm just going to leave everything on the default settings, and that should be hopefully relatively quick. Okay, so let me just use this time to explain you a few things. So this is now putting all the images together, and then, so it's stitching the panorama into 3 different layers, and then it's merging these 3 different exposure layers into one ginormous 32-bit floating point image, which has all the details from the brightest to the darkest bit in it. This image then I could take to my HDR tone mapping or exposure fusion tool, but then we're going to have these edge effects that I was alluding to earlier. Now the trick is, rather than just work on this image directly, we're actually going to create a second image. And this is where a trick comes in. I was doing the same tutorial last week, I think, and had sort of proposed my idea of how you could do this. And then I got some feedback from a nice gentleman called Stephen Tyler. He's another very good photographer from Newcastle, and he pointed out that there's an even better way. Now, I haven't seen this anywhere online, and so I'm just going to give full credit to Stephen. Stephen, if you're listening to this, thank you very much for pointing this out. Because that way, as you will see in a minute, it's a very sneaky trick, but that way you don't need Photoshop or anything to merge your panoramas together. So this is the first image that we've exported now, and we've got our dangerous edges here. So the top frame and the bottom frame would be completely messed up by our tone mapping program, as well as the side frame. So just check out where that side frame here is. That's sort of going through, it's just opposite to this bright valley back here, and it's sort of going through the back side. Now here comes the trick. We're going to apply a nice numerical transform where we're basically wrapping the image inside out. Now these values are very important. It's 180 degrees, so we're going to flip it. We're going to turn our head around, and we're going to roll our head by 90 degrees. Might look weird, might look a bit weird, and what you're getting now is even worse. But have a look at what we're seeing here. We're looking away from that valley, and we're looking backwards into that forest, and we've got our zenith, which was troublesome, as well as the nadir, all in the center of the image. So my tone mapping program that's going to do some local stuff is just going to treat all this area here nicely in exactly the same way. It's going to treat this area nice in the same way, and it's going to treat this area in a consistent way. So now, again, it is going to mess up the sides of the frame, but we don't care because we get the sides of the frame from that other shot that we just exported. Here's that other shot. Well, it's very dark, but anyway, we've got all the far horizon as well as that middle part here beautifully in that shot, whereas in this shot, we'll get all the zenith, the nadir, and the backwards direction. So I'm going to export that shot. Once again, same settings, different file name. Let's call this zenith and nadir. Same thing, export it. In the meantime, now just to save some more time, let me import this image into Lightroom and start doing a very quick and dirty tone mapping on it. There we go. Lightroom, by the way, this is actually the Lightroom 5 beta, but ever since version 4.1, I believe, of Lightroom, you could open HDR images, 32-bit TIFFs in Lightroom and just treat it as a normal image. And the nice thing is, at least I, by now, have become very familiar with these sliders here on the side. They have a lot more meaning to me than all these many sliders you can get in HDR software. Of course, you're going to have more control in dedicated HDR software, But again, I'm not a scientist. I actually enjoy just using these very nice sliders here. And check this out. Have a look at the value range this goes. This goes to +10 and goes to -10. So that way you can actually see we've got all the details here in that sun. There's nothing blown out. And we've also got all the detail here in that back forest. Okay, well I didn't. So the source brackets for this, I think, were -3 EV, 0, and +3 EV. So that's like a span of 6 EVs in terms of the brackets. So that's a huge range, and we're getting some noise in here. But then again, this is dark forest. We don't expect to see anything important in there. So let's have a look. Bring down the highlights, yank up the shadows, and bring up the exposure a little bit. We're getting a nice little HDR look into here. Again, I'm no expert in this, and this is a huge topic of debate, or not debate, but this is a thing that's up to your taste of how you process your image. Let's just say we're going to treat this image like that. Let's have a look. PTGui finished this one. Yep. Well, maybe we'll just save the project quickly. I can close it now, and we've got the zenith and nadir panorama. Let me add that into Lightroom as well. And what I want to do now is treat this image in exactly the same way as before. Now, where did that go? It's probably in here. There we go. That's these two images. Let me add them to the quick collection. That's the two images that I've just exported. Now, I'm just going to take the settings from this image, move over to the next one, and paste all the settings in. So these two images are now being treated in pretty much the same way by Lightroom. Okay, so let's export these two images. So this you would do in your other HDR software. You don't have to do this in Lightroom, but basically you're treating the two images, and you want to treat them in exactly the same way. Let's put it maybe on the desktop. Why not? Okay, so whatever settings you apply to one image, you want to do the exact same settings to both images, so that you get sort of a similar look for the two. Once the exporting is done, I'm going to launch PTGui. Now we're going to go back into PTGui and warp this image, which looks a bit funny, right? Warp this image back into into the normal perspective as we had before. Now, a quick word of caution. I don't know which version of PTGui you have. More recent versions of PTGui automatically detect if you're adding in an image which has a 2:1 aspect ratio. It'll automatically interpret it as an equirectangular panorama with a 360-degree field of view. If that's not the case, you may have to manually tell it that it's an equirectangular panorama, 360 degrees of view. I think you've got the same settings in here. Now, as I said, we want to warp it back, and the same transformation, interestingly enough, we're going to apply the same transformation just as before. So again, 180-degree yaw and 90-degree roll. And shebang, we're back in our normal view. Now look closely at these parts here. You can see some really weird, sort of almost like a black hole effect, as if pixels are being sucked into there. This is what the if I undo my transformation, this is what the zenith, that's the zenith, and the nadir in this image, they're going to become these 2 points. But that's fine. We don't care about this because we're not going to take the image, we're not going to use these parts of the image. What we're going to use from that image is just the top edge and the bottom edge, as well as the side edge. So with this image, I can now add in the previous image as well, the normal one, add that on top. What did I do? Source images, they're both the same. Image parameters. For some reason, it's added some parameter. It's changed the transformation values for this image. Nope, I just want it as it is. Now these two images are basically sitting on top. Here's one, here's the other. And what I now do is I'll just use PTGui again to just merge these two images together. And how do I tell PTGui not to use parts from one image but use parts from the other? Well, I can just use my masks. So let me go to this image. And from this image, that was the original one, not the warped one, but the original one. And we said we don't want to use the edges of that image. So let me just draw a nice fat line along the edges here, down to there, there, and over here. So we're forbidding PTGui to use the sides of the edges. And in these images here, well, let's say we don't want to use the sides either. So I'm just going to reduce my brush a little bit. And also draw around these edges that we don't want to have included in our panorama. So going back, you can see from this image we can only use the internal part, which is nice. And from that image we can only use the external parts, but not these weird areas. Actually, in fact, I can actually probably increase the forbidden zone a little bit, like so. Okay. We should still have enough overlap between the two images. Yep. So that all works perfectly. So let's go over to the export tab, export the image, and because now it's no longer a HDR image, right? By the way, I should have told you that when I exported it here from Photoshop, from Lightroom, I exported it as an 8-bit TIFF. So it's just a plain and simple 8-bit file. You can't see it in here, but anyway, you just have to trust me. It's an 8-bit file. So when we export it, we'll also just export it as an 8-bit TIFF file. No alpha channel, LZW. Let's use again, a fast transformation, and let's say finally done, because that is the last step. Now we're just going to use PTGui to put these two images together and just take the good parts from both images, and we're finally done. Let's have a look if that all worked out. And well, hey, look at that. There's no more ugly vortex. There's no vertical line going through the image. And if you're looking down, there's also nothing on the ground. Isn't that pretty? So there you have it. That's a very nice, neat trick. Kudos go again to Steven Tyler, or Talking to You is his nickname, for pointing this out to me. And I hope basically the whole process is clear. So again, your normal HDR tone mapping software is oblivious to the fact that the edges of your frame have a particular meaning, and you can basically only safely use the internal part of the image. So in order to circumvent that problem is we've warped our image, where we're basically turning all the edges into the middle of the frame. Again, apply the same tone mapping settings to it, and then we warp it back. Now that we've got the center of the frame, which is good, we warp it back to the edges. And then we've got two images, one where the frame is good and one where the internal part of the image is good. And then we just used some sneaky masking to combine the two images back into one. And there you have it. That's my little HDR tutorial when it comes to 360 by 180 panoramas. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Love to hear from you. Other than that, I'll hear you back for the next tutorial. Bye!